Better at Chess Nation. What is going on? This is Terrence B, and this is going to be an analysis video of the Stalemate game that I teased in my lesson video. Now, this game is very long. It's about 73 moves, and covering a complete analysis of this game would take at least 40 minutes to an hour, and that's moving quickly. So, what I decided I will do instead is I'm going to cover missed wins in this game, and I'm also going to talk about the stalemate situation that we ultimately ended up with. Okay, so let's start with missed win number one. So here's the setup. So my opponent is white, I'm playing as black. As you can see, I'm getting my butt handed to me. This was not a good game for me at all. This wasn't a great game for me. This was just a bad game. So I have a king that's in the middle of the board. I have two pawns that are widely separated, and I have this nice little rook on g8. My opponent is castled on the king side, has three pawns in front of him, has a rook here in this corner that it can bring out at any time. They have these two pawns connected right here. They have this knight and this rook right here. So my opponent is in good shape. So let's talk about missed win number one. So my last move was, my king was in check. I decided to move up here towards the rook because I wanted to try to get some counterplay and attack the rook. My opponent decides to take this pawn. So this missed win right here is, instead of taking the pawn, move this rook out this corner to protect this rook. So let's look at the squares that the king could go to, right? So this pawn is not moving. This rook can move, but it's not really any good square for my rook right now. I mean, maybe my rook can come here, attack this pawn. But in a couple moves, you'll see why, if I was paying enough attention and my opponent was paying enough attention, that there wasn't much I can do from this situation right here. It doesn't look like much now. However, we'll get into it. So right now, my rook can move there. This pawn could go here. My king is, actually, my king is stuck to this box right there. Though each square is a square my king can go to. Let's look at what's cut off. That's cut off by both of these rooks. These two squares are cut off by this rook, which is being protected by this rook. Okay, so this square is cut off because of this pawn. This square is cut off because of this pawn. So literally my king has this square right here, this square that unhighlighted. That is where my king can go. Right there. That's it. Now, if my king goes here, so let's see what happens. Okay, so let's look at squares my king can go to. That square, that square, that square, that square, that square, that square, and that square, and that square, right? Those are the squares my king can go to right now. So that's cut off because of the rook. This square is cut off because of my pawn, and that's cut off because of that pawn. This square is cut off because of that pawn, and this square is cut off because of that pawn. Now, this move right here is a check. If my king can't go anywhere, it's a checkmate. My king can only go here, this square that got unhighlighted. So tell me, if this rook moves here, is it still going to be in check? Yes, it is, which means that move right there is a checkmate. This is checkmate. So my opponent was about 2 moves away from checkmate. So a theme you're going to see in this series, and in hopefully the majority of the analysis I do, is that you are only a few moves away from checkmate. And I want to help you guys get there. Alright, let's keep it going. So in this setup, my king has moved over here. Alright. My knight is putting this king in, or I'm not, sorry, not my knight. White's knight is putting my king in check. And I only have a few options here, right? So since I'm in check, I have to either 1, move out of check, 2, take the piece checking me, or 3, block the check. Since this is a knight, you cannot block a check because knights jump over pieces the way they move, so they attack over pieces as well. So there's no such thing as blocking a knight attack. So I'm stuck with moving out of check or taking a knight. There's no piece on the board that can take the knight, so I'm stuck with the only option to move out of check. So let's look at the possible king moves. Okay, so this box, these are the squares the king can usually move to. Everything in this row was cut off because of this rook. This square that unhighlighted is cut off because of this pawn right here. This pawn is unprotected. And these squares right here are also cut off because of this rook. So my only squares are this square and this square. Now, had I been paying more attention, I would have played this move instead of this move. But I played this move. So let's read this for a second, right? So this knight was attacking the king on the square. Now it's protecting this square and this square, right? This pawn is protecting that square, and this pawn still isn't being attacked, but it's protecting this pawn right here, right? Since I didn't attack this pawn on my move, that means this pawn is staying on the board for at least one more move. Why is that important? It's important because this rook right here can go here and put me in check. And if I can't escape said check, it's checkmate. Well, based on what I just said, this pawn is protecting this pawn, is protecting this pawn, which is protecting this rook, which if this rook moves to this square, it's still protecting this rook, which means moving here, and let's look at it. So that was a better move. Instead I played that, my opponent decided to bring up that pawn instead of playing there, which would have been checkmate. That's why that's a miswin. Like, that was the move to make. That is checkmate. So this pawn is protecting this pawn is protecting this rook, and this rook is protecting this pawn. You see the triangle right there. That is powerful. That is nasty. So these two pawns make up a pawn island. The only way to take away or destroy a pawn island is to take the weakest link of the pawn island, which is usually in the back of the pawn island, which is this pawn right there. By me not doing that, I left a pawn island that ultimately could have lost me the game had I seen this, had my opponent seen this. Let's keep it going. Alright, so this is move 60 right here. So here's the situation. My opponent has the two rooks and they're staggered, which is great for two rooks, because with them staggering, they can let's see. So this rook is putting me in check, which means I'm going to this row right here, which means if I don't go to this square, that's checkmate. So yeah, so that was a good move, and they were saying a better move would have put the knight here, because again, you know, it's not like I can come attack that knight because this rook is there. So I move there. The reason I move there is because I know about the two rook checkmate, and I know if I go there, this rook isn't moving there. So my opponent decided to move that rook over here because they were trying to get two rook checkmate from the other side. The problem is this: one, I can move to this square. I can move to this square right there. Two, my rook is here to potentially stop that attack if I need to move it, if it feels like the right move next move. So I have two options here. I chose this one because I can just take the rook. I would rather get a rook off the board than, you know, bring my rook over there. So that seemed like the better move to me, and as you can see from chess.com, they said that is the best move to make. So they decided to move their other rook. Okay, smart. Getting their rook away from my king is going to take 3 moves just for me to make the same amount of moves as this rook. That's important. So when it comes to the two rook checkmate, which you'll see in other videos, your rook can move across the board in one move, which would take the king 7 or 8 moves. Let's keep going. So knowing that, I decided to do that. And actually, let's go back because I missed the win. So chess.com recommended knight to d4, and here's why. So this knight is protecting this rook, right? This rook wants to get to this square. This rook moving to this square is checkmate if my king can move away from that square. So this pawn is stuck right here. My king is not going anywhere because they want to protect that square. My only move here is to try to get some counterplay. I move my rook there, right? Put the king in check. They're going to take, of course, but at least now I have a little bit of breathing room. But not much. These are the squares the king can move to, as of now. That's, you know, out the question, because this rook is controlling that. This is out the question because of this knight right here. So I have this square and this square. These two unhighlighted squares are the two squares I have left. So that was my move. You know, white decided to take my rook, being forced to move either, you know, up 1 or over 1, you know, up to a4, over to b4. It doesn't really matter, and the reason being is because, one, this rook is controlling this file right here, so even if I did go to b4, this rook will still come back here to push me back to the a file. So now the king's only move is to go here. So the king goes there. That's the best move. If it goes here, the king decides to go here, That's checkmate. So the king has to go back to protect this square by moving here. Okay. So they move up there. Now here's where having this knight right here comes in handy. This knight moves over to here to b5. b5 is checking the king right here. Since the king cannot go this way and it can't go anywhere here, this move right here is forced, as in this is the king's only move. Why is that important? Because this knight is using a key tactic called removing the defender. And I'll get more into removing the defender later, but it's important to remove a defender because a defender of a certain square will stop you from getting checkmate. See, when this was set up, checkmate seemed to, I mean, you can see the checkmate, but it was like, okay, well, how am I going to get checkmate? By having the knight come here, removing this defender here, making them go to this square, now you have the checkmate known as the 2-rook checkmate, which is moving that rook here to this square. The rook can't move to this square because this king is protecting that square. So the rook will have to use other options. But this is the easiest, fastest way to checkmate, using this. So, king's forced there, checkmate. Alright, let's keep it going. Alright, so here's the setup right here. Move 62. I've finally moved that rook over here in the same row as my king. My opponent decides to move there instead of moving the knight here. So let's go over the missed win. So coming here, now this one's going to be a little bit more complex, so we're kind of going to run through it and I'll kind of explain. But it's important to get here. So rook tries to make some counterplay on the knight by attacking it. That rook right there decides to attack the king. Because now with this rook here, my king can no longer go in this direction because this piece is blocking it. This rook here is cutting off everything in front of the king. So let's look at the squares the king could go to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is done, and this is done because the rook is there. So this is the only square I have. That unhighlighted square right there. So white decides to check the king here to force the king in the corner. White doubles up the rooks. This rook decides to move here because they don't want the knight going to this square right here. This square right here is going to be checkmate if it gets there. So instead, the rook moves up one, putting the king in check. King moves. The other rook moves up, putting the king in check. Now the king is out of that corner. Now, here's where the importance of the knight comes in. So the knight does that, putting the king in check. Now the king has two options. Take the knight, move the king. Moving the king is dangerous because if the rook moves there, this rook is going to move there. And then this rook that's here could just take the rook, and that's a checkmate. So the rook black decides that this is the better move, taking the knight. But not really, because the rook moves up and takes the knight. Now, this pawn is still stuck here. So the only piece that can move is the king. This king is in a situation where this rook is guarding this foul. So this king cannot go this way. This rook is guarding everything in front of it. So the king is forced to move away from that important square and move this way, which, moving away, leads to this checkmate. Alright, let's keep it going. And this missed win goes into the stalemate scenario, so I'm going to be explaining these two at the same time here. Okay, so here we are. Here's the setup, right? My king wants to take this rook out. Now my opponent has to decide, is it important to keep this rook or gain a queen? Or gain a queen or any other piece. It might not want the queen, but I'm assuming it wants the queen. Most players, they usually get a queen early on, and then once they play through more in-game situations, they go for what's best for the situation, which might be a rook or a bishop or a knight. So assuming my player's gonna go for a queen, that was those are choices they have: lose the rook, gain the queen, or keep the rook and wait a move to gain the queen. So I go for the rook, thinking, okay, well, I can at least try to get the rook out the way. They decide to move the rook. Now, here's what I noticed. My king, first thing I noticed, this rook is cutting off this file, right? So my only two squares right now would be here and here with my king. I can move up one with my rook to right there, putting the king in check. Okay, that's all that's important to note here, right? But my king is on the same file as the square that this pawn is going to promote to. If it promotes to a queen, it's going to put me in check on this square. So I'm thinking if I want to get a stalemate or play for a stalemate, because obviously I'm not really playing to win in this situation, is that I need to move here. Because if that promotes to a queen, this square is going to be cut off and I would have no legal moves with my king. Which means the only thing I would need to do is get rid of this pawn. So that was my logic behind me heading into the corner. That's why I did that. This whole row was cut off for me, and now I only have one legal move unless my opponent promotes to anything that's not a queen here, but they promote to a queen. So now this square, and this square, my only 3 squares I can move. That's cut off. This is cut off. I have no legal moves with my king. Half the stalemate battle is won right here. My next move, get rid of the pawn. So that move was forced because my king cannot move anywhere. So white had some options here. They could have moved here. They could have moved here. Those were really the 2 true options there. And really, this, you know, this square right here is not really an option. So, but my opponent decided to take the pawn. So now let's go over why it was a bad idea to do so. So, if my opponent decided to, say, move, actually, there instead, I can do that, become a queen. They can either move here or bring this queen down. Bring this queen down. So they'll probably bring the queen down. My queen would take. Their king would take. I would probably move this way. Their king would either stay, you know, maybe get. They said actually moving a knight was probably a better move, and that is just clearing the way for this pawn to promote to a queen or a rook, whatever you need in the situation. So, back here. Okay. So my opponent took, but they said F1 was a better move, and you know, here's why. That whole situation I just talked about. And you know, my king is steady moving towards this rook, but this knight will probably move here next, and that's just clearing the way to promote to a queen. So now let's go back to the missed win. So the missed win here was again knight to e3. So there's 3 times my opponent had to move to knight to e3, which would have saved the game for my opponent. So starting off with knight to e3. Now, if my opponent plays knight to e3, I have 2 moves. It's either get to this square, which, again, if they get to that square, they promote to a queen that's attacking me. I go here or here. It doesn't matter. Or move my pawn up. So in this case, moving the pawn up seemed like would have been a logical move. My opponent would take in this case because they have nothing to lose at that point. Now I'm forced out of that corner to that square. They can become a queen then, attacking my king. And at this point, you know, moving up or down doesn't matter. If I move down, that's checkmate. If I move up, that's checkmate. And the reason that's checkmate is because, again, this rook is cutting off this file. This queen is cutting off the square, which means my king is in a corner with no legal moves. But it's my opponent's turn and not mine, so this isn't a stalemate anymore. Moving this knight here is now a checkmate. That is the video on 5 missed wins and stalemate. I hope you enjoyed this video. Comment below. Tell me your thoughts. Tell me if you would like me to do a full in-depth analysis of all 73 moves of this game. I will do that if that's what you guys want. Until then, take care, and I'll see you for my next one. Bye.